Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/home soon.
CHEK Podcasts.
Well, hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. Thank you so much for joining us this week. As we say each and every week, there is a ton going on in BC politics. This week is no exception. We're going to talk a little bit about the vote that was coming up at some point this session on the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act changes by the EB government. Does he have the votes? Could we be heading to an election? We're going to talk about the controversy over coffee cup advertising and marketing by the BC government and the Fire John Rustad website investigative report that came out this week. To do it all, we're going to bring in the panel. Jillian is back from much needed summer break. Jillian, thanks for being back. Jeff Ferrier and Angelo Isidoro are here as well. The Pod Squad has reconvened to tackle the topics of the week. And thank you for being here. The first one we're going to get to here is DRIPA. The Premier says there are some amendments to suspend parts of DRIPA coming as early as this week. The question is whether he has the votes to pass them. There's news that First Nations leaders would like Indigenous MLAs in the NDP to vote against this. There's 3 Indigenous MLAs. Joan Phillip, whose husband is Grand Chief Stuart Phillip from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. He is out saying his wife doesn't support this. The Premier has designated it a confidence vote, and we're all trying to figure out what it means. Jillian, let's start with you on that. DRIPA, the changes, the confidence vote, maybe the NDP not having the votes. What does all this mean, do you think?
Well, I think first, let's talk about how this does not need to be a confidence vote. And I think there's a lot of tell in the Premier's decision to designate it as one. I think it shows, one, that he is trying to exert control over his caucus and essentially whip them into submission when there is obvious internal disagreement. We got confirmation of that. And also to turn up the attention on it, to show a public that is increasingly skeptical of his ability to sort of tidy this up and provide certainty on the issue, that he's, taking strong action. I think, it just shows how far behind the 8 ball the government has gotten on this issue. They introduced DRIPA many years ago when John Horgan was still Premier with much fanfare. And then we're very slow and to implement it in a way that provided certainty and that managed to keep anybody happy, because now they've lost the support of First Nations, they've lost support of all of the opposition parties and of potentially parts of their own caucus. So it's spiraled out of control, and I'm not sure what's going to happen from here.
Do we think the Premier wants an election, Jeff? Like, he designating this as a confidence matter and maybe not having the votes is a recipe for disaster for the government. Do we think the Premier wants this to be an election issue?
If he wanted an election, he would not want it on this issue. Every time he talks about DRIPA, it loses him votes. I mean, that's the reality of where public opinion is at on this issue and the box that the Premier's in. Like, this is one thing I think is important, is this is not a creation of David Eby where we're at. It is, if it were easy to solve this, John Horgan would have solved it, or Christy Clark would have solved it, or Gordon Campbell, or Bill Bennett, or W.A.C. Bennett. It's a issue that is tied up in the history of the province of folks not signing treaties with First Nations years and years ago, and it puts us in the box that we are now, where we're dealing through court decisions what that all means. Look, there can always be a spring election. I think Jillian's right, though. I think the solution for the Premier on this in the short term is to deconfidence the confidence vote in which the Premier has low confidence.
Could he also, this is just me spitballing here, could the issue of Joan Phillip's health also keeps coming up? Could there be a by-election? Could we throw that in? Could there be, I guess there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but before we go back around on that, sorry, Angelo, let's bring you in. What do you think of where everything is at right now?
Well, I think we're underestimating the power of hubris, right? This didn't need to be a confidence vote by the premier. And just a few days ago at a press conference, he said that he was confident in his caucus that they would have the votes. And now we find out today, being April 10th, that Joan Phillip will not vote for these amendments. We are going to have the first reading come first, and I don't suspect there to be any issues on that. However, it does appear that the premier is seemingly unaware or ignorant or doesn't care that he may well thrust the province into a spring election. And maybe that is just him between a rock and a hard place. He can either die on the Hill and be held hostage by, perhaps a minority of his caucus who are very pro-DRIPA and don't want it to be altered, but then suffer the consequences of public polling and public opinion continuing to sour on this legislation.
A spring election would be not optimal for any parties, I don't think, Jillian. To go back to you on this, you have the Greens with a new leader-ish who's still out there kind of making a name for herself. You've got the Conservatives in the middle of a leadership race, which would throw that into some level of chaos. And you've got the premier trending downwards in a sharp trajectory on his approval ratings. As to Jeff points out, I can't imagine this is really what the NDP wants, but do you think they would see it through if they had to go this way?
I mean, this is going to be such an interesting week. They have other options. There's a whole bunch of independents that they can be lobbying to try to get some votes. Those independents' jobs are probably even most at risk, even with, how you explained all the other parties are precarious. It's so hard to get elected as an independent. We saw former BC United MLAs run as independents that did not get elected, even though they were incumbent MLAs in their ridings. So, we could see an act of self-preservation by some of those more moderate independents. It's really hard to imagine how an election would go. I do think the Conservatives could do a lot worse than Trevor Halford. He's a really safe choice for an interim leader. He's experienced, he's well-spoken, he's quite moderate. It's a huge risk for the NDP with the numbers and the support levels where they are.
Jeff, what do you think of that? If Trevor Halford is the candidate who ends up being fielded at the head of the Conservatives in a snap spring election, he may be more appealing to voters than whoever comes out of the leadership race. Is that a risk to the NDP too?
I think Trevor Halford is kicking himself that he agreed to become the interim leader of the BC Conservatives and didn't take the opportunity to run for the leadership himself. I watched the Conservative Party debate with Juno News this week. We'll talk about that in the podcast portion. I thought they all did okay. I thought Ian Black probably did the best of them all, but I think Trevor Halford would have done better than all of them. Let's remember that everyone voted for DRIPA, including Trevor Halford, though, so the issue is not as cut and dried as some would make it out to be, and it'd be interesting to see how this play out in election if we came to that.
Angelo, I mean, you're a strategist. You're looking at all the computations and permutations on this. What do you think is going to happen?
Oh, God. What do I think is going to happen?
Just predict the future. That's all I need you to do here. Just go ahead.
Oh, that's all you need me to do?
Yeah.
Well, look, I think if I was the premier and I was the NDP, I would be making the calculation of what exactly is going to get better for me. I mean, being in government is always better than not being in government. But what if it means that I, as premier, am going to be removed by my own party? Maybe I want to roll the dice now. What if it means that the economy is going to get worse, that healthcare is going to get worse, that this land issue is not going to go away? In fact, it's going to get even worse in its own right. Is it better to perhaps force an election now than later? I think that's a real calculation. But ultimately for the Conservatives, Trevor Halford has done an exceptional job as interim leader. He has a united caucus. The party is in very good shape. The membership has skyrocketed. I'm fairly certain the Conservatives will beat the NDP in the quarterly numbers for Q1. So the longer that this drags on, frankly, the more organized and powerful our opposition becomes. So that is a calculation the NDP need to make.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. We'll leave it there on this topic. We'll take a quick break. Coming up, $165 cups of coffee paid for by the government. We'll get into that coming up next. All right, welcome back. Our next topic here. How much is a cup of coffee worth to you? $5, maybe one of those fancy lattes I know Jeff likes, $7 or $8 even. Well, if you're the BC government, the answer is $165 a cup, the price tag for government to run a coffee truck promotional move in Seattle last June to appeal to healthcare workers by giving them free cups of coffee, asking the Americans to come work up here. The $165,000 invoice dug up by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So, Jeff, I'm going to go to you first on this one because I do remember the coffee truck being your political play of the week just not that long ago. Does the cost change anything in the calculation for you on that? And what do you think of the numbers?
I stand by my choice that this is a positive thing for British Columbians. Canadian Taxpayers Federation, they're into juvenile gotcha type of politics. I'd sure like to know who funds them, which has never been clear when dealing with them. I think this is the best deal in British Columbia since the Vancouver Canadians launched the 75-cent hot dog. The $165,000 was for an entire campaign. It begat millions of dollars of earned media in the United States, not selling coffee, selling British Columbia as a place for healthcare workers to come. We got 500 healthcare workers as a result of this. And if you look at if you want to really dig into the value of this, for a recruiter to recruit one doctor, it's typically cost $20,000 to $50,000 per doctor. We got 500 for $165,000. That's good value. It's good for British Columbians, and it's good for our healthcare system.
Julian, I think it's all kind of in the framing of it in a way. $165,000 to do a marketing stunt to help hire American healthcare workers. That maybe doesn't seem as bad, but then when you put it down for the price of coffee, it sounds kind of ridiculous. So maybe it's how it's being framed by those crafty folks at the Taxpayers Federation. But what did you think of the numbers?
Yeah, it's kind of ironic because it actually just is good marketing for the BC Taxpayers Federation cause. And these are the kinds of stories that can get good headlines because they spark outrage. But in addition to all of the numbers that Jeff quoted, it also costs like hundreds of thousands of dollars to train a new doctor. It's taken years to get the new SFU medical school up and running. That's supposed to happen this fall, but I've heard that it's they've got lots of challenges and confusion happening over there to actually get that going. I think most people recognize how urgent it is, the need to have more doctors up here. Still, I think even, with this story this week, the bigger headlines are about ER closures, maternity ward closures. That's much more tangible for people and top of mind. And I think that's, what they're going to be sort of judging performance on.
Mm-hmm. Angelo, what do you think?
Well, I am outraged because even though we do have more healthcare workers, it's not obvious that you can tie it directly to $165 cup of coffee. I think another element that's problematic is just how difficult it was for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation to get this information. They submitted FOIs. They had to deal with bureaucracy for months just to get this invoice that shows that in addition to the truck, there were brand ambassadors and producers. This is ultimately taxpayer money, and we do want to be able to invite people into British Columbia, and we need more doctors and healthcare workers. But ultimately, it's not obvious how, what seems like a publicity stunt actually produced any real, tangible correlation in the data of new members.
There's a good point there. I mean, the government wasn't upfront about the cost, obviously, for a reason. They weren't comfortable with that cost. And it's not clear how many of the 500 American healthcare workers came because of this. But nonetheless, probably not the worst marketing idea for the government, trying something new. Who knows? We'll see if that takes up any more political oxygen in the room. We're going to take a quick break because coming up, we want to talk about the Fire John Rustad scandal from 2 years ago, which is still interesting. Trust me. You want to listen to this right after the break. All right, welcome back. Elections BC out with a very interesting report this week that looked back at a website called firejohnrustad.ca. It came online just before the last provincial election in August. At a time, it was billed as conservatives upset about John Rustad's leadership, signing a petition to remove him from his office. There was mailers that went out. There was attacks on conservative candidates. It turns out Election BC found that it was BC United responsible for this website just in the weeks before they ended up folding their tent and bowing out of the election with the Conservatives. lots of recriminations on this, partly because of linkages to the Conservative leadership campaign. The campaign manager for BC United, who's pointed to in this report, Mark Werner, is the campaign manager for Peter Milobar in the leadership campaign. You got all sorts of finger pointing and butt covering and denials and things going on here. Kind of a fascinating topic. Jeff, jump in on this one. BC United runs a secret website pretending to be Conservatives right before the last election, going after John Rustad. What do you think of all that?
Well, BC United, when are they ever going to win? What a disaster that was. Good job. I think misinformation is a big problem in politics today. Folks want to make decisions based on facts and evidence, and more it's about clicks based on deliberately incorrect information. I think the BC Conservatives have every right to be upset about what happened here, about the misinformation, about the lack of transparency. But holy heck, if Elections BC is appointing itself to be the police service for misinformation in politics, they're going to need a bigger boat. There's so much of it that's out there, and there's no way that one single agency is going to be able to bring it to heel. I expect that the only way you're going to deal with misinformation is for political parties to litigate it and for voters to judge.
Yeah, it is a little weird that they put basically a year of investigation into this when we see these kind of weird websites and sketchy stuff done all the time. But I mean, I'm glad they did it. But you're right. There's a lot of it out there. Angelo, what do you think of this this whole thing, which you would have sort of seen in your role as the campaign director for the Conservatives running into the election around this time?
Yeah, it's a particularly personal story. I recall in August of 24, this website coming up. And anytime you see a very slick website that says, we're just grassroots volunteers that are really concerned, it's very obvious that someone is paying for it. We had assumed that it was BC United, but we didn't have any evidence. I think what was extra problematic about the website, besides the fact that it besmirched our leader, who I would remind everyone, we lost the majority government by 395 votes and potentially a minority by 22 votes. It also made some remarks about Teresa Watt that I would consider, racially motivated, that were highly inappropriate, in my opinion. So, it is something that popped in the back of my head. Another strange anecdote about the website is that after BC United folded, our campaign, I was actually questioned by the police over it because they got a tip that suggested that we were, I guess, sabotaging our own leader, which we were simultaneously trying to elect. So very, very odd. It does happen, to Jeff's point, in politics. So it is, this is a particularly nasty case. And it's particularly also odd that it took so long for this to come out. But I totally understand John's anger, right? He's incredibly frustrated about this because if I were him and I was there with him, it was very frustrating to see something that essentially gave off the impression of being grassroots conservatives who were also receiving letters in the mail around this. So whoever was doing this, I guess we know who was doing it, also seemingly had access to older data of the party. So it's potentially problematic on several levels.
Yeah, there's a linkage to an Alberta political operative company, and you're right. There was a physical mail-out part of it too that seemed to catch the police attention. Where'd that list come from? How did that get mailed? And comments that were factually incorrect about an MLA. Although, I mean, not to take anything away from what was said about Teresa Watt, but there's factually inaccurate things said in mail-outs all the time about MLAs. So it's amazing to me that this was also investigated to the point of police, interrogations. But Jillian, what do you think of this whole crazy, weird story?
Yeah, it is interesting. My first thought, I kind of sort of vaguely remembered it because to Jeff and Angela's point, we see these kinds of websites all the time. They've been present in every campaign that I've been a part of. I remember them around Per Rep, around ones going after the NDP. And outside of the campaign period, there is a lot of leeway to do all kinds of advertising. I think it's the misinformation in this case that was so glaring. But then again, I've seen all parties say things that are not entirely accurate. And it's interesting that Elections BC decided to really see this particular instance through. It makes me think that there was probably folks, wanting to get clarity and kind of settle the score, really driving it to its conclusion. And it's going to be really interesting to see if we see Elections BC take up this kind of thing more, because it is a huge question mark. How they sort of are responding to increasing instances of misinformation coming from all sides of the political field. Now, I think also coming out now during the leadership race is also kind of turns up the intrigue on it, because it very much relates to some of the underlying dynamics that we're seeing in that race, where we kind of have this dynamic of former BC United or BC Liberals versus like the true blue Conservatives, and does that matter, and how are they going to kind of reformulate their coalition, and what do their voters think about it? So very interesting thing to get thrown into the mix this week.
Yeah, I'll add one more quick thing, Rob.
Yeah.
Rob, I think the other big part of this is that there wasn't any authorization tag, right? Like we didn't know. It wouldn't say authorized by BC United or authorized by whoever. It was anonymous, right? That's why even now that this is sort of done and dusted, it's not exactly, we know who the company is that did it, but it's not exactly clear who knew or who didn't know. So I think, it's a big thing in BC politics and in Canada that you need to have authorization on every piece of material that goes out.
And I'll just point out real quick that it doesn't strike me that the website had any impact on votes, but maybe it had an impact on all the MLAs of the BC Conservative Party who decided to fire John Rustad after the election because he was professionally incapacitated.
That's good. Good way to work that term in. It's always good to have one of the greatest terms in BC political history worked in.
Folks at home, take your drink.
Okay. All right. Thank you to the panel for being here. Thank you for watching. We have more content in the audio version of the podcast, so make sure you check that out. And we will be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/home soon.